Dust rolled off the prairie that morning when the wedding bells began to toll. Folks came from miles around to see the rancher take his new bride, pretty as spring rain, quiet as a secret. But just as the preacher raised his hand, a small voice cut through the hush. A little boy stood there, tears trembling on his lashes. "That's my mama," he said, pointing at the bride. And in that single breath, every lie she'd buried, every truth she'd prayed would stay hidden, came riding straight out of the past. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Morning sunlight poured over the open prairie like a slow-spreading fire, gilding every blade of grass in soft gold as if heaven itself wanted to bless the day. The small frontier town of Willow Creek had not seen such celebration in years. The bell atop the whitewashed chapel swung with long, deliberate notes, calling ranch hands, widows, and weary travelers alike to witness the union of Thomas Grady and the mysterious woman he'd chosen as his bride. Thomas stood tall beneath the old cottonwood tree, hat in hand, his weathered face drawn by the years of drought, loss, and the long silence that follows a man who's buried more dreams than he's spoken aloud. He was the kind of man the land respected, a man who didn't talk much, but when he did, folks listened. His word had built fences and settled debts, but today, it was his heart on the line. Evelyn Hart stood across from him, the wind catching her veil and tossing it softly against her cheek. She looked like something pulled out of another world, refined, delicate, her pale dress bright against the rough timber and dust. But there was something in her stillness that wasn't peace, it was control, the kind of stillness a person learns when they've had to hide fear long enough for it to become second nature. Beneath her calm, her eyes trembled like a wild creature waiting for the gate to open, torn between running and staying. Folks had their whispers about her, how she'd shown up one cold night at Grady's ranch with nothing but a torn satchel and a prayer, offering to cook and clean until she could find her bearings. Some said she'd been a widow, others swore she was running from something darker. But Thomas had taken her in without question, the way a man sometimes takes in a stray horse, because he sees something in its eyes that reminds him of his own lost fight. And in the months that followed, she had proven herself steady, humble, quiet, the kind of woman who could soften the edges of a hard man's life. The townsfolk had come to respect her silence, mistaking it for virtue. But today, beneath the cottonwood's shade, silence felt like something else entirely, like a story she hadn't finished telling. The preacher's voice rose above the breeze, worn and patient, his words falling over the gathering like scripture pressed into wet clay. The crowd stood in respectful hush, yet behind the stillness there was a hum of curiosity, about the stranger in white, about the rancher's choice to trust her with his name, his home, and his heart. Children perched on fence rails, women fanned themselves with their bonnets, and the men stood with hats pressed to their chests, nodding solemnly as the vows began. But even as the preacher spoke of love and truth, Thomas's gaze caught a flicker in Evelyn's expression, something fleeting and sharp, like a ghost passing through. For an instant, her lips moved in a whisper he couldn't hear. Perhaps it was a prayer, or maybe a name. A tremor ran through her hands before she steadied them, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. He wondered then if love could truly mend what memory refused to forget. The prairie wind swept across the gathering, lifting dust and petals into the air, and for a brief, breathless moment, everything felt suspended, between promise and revelation, between the life they were about to begin and the secrets she carried to this altar. Somewhere beyond the horizon, thunder murmured low, though no storm was yet in sight. The preacher lifted his hand to bless the union, the bells echoing across the wide plains. And just as the world seemed ready to exhale, Evelyn's eyes darted toward the ridge, a flicker of panic flashing before she caught herself. The murmur of wind through the grass seemed to whisper her name, dragging something buried deep within her closer to the surface. For now, she smiled and bowed her head, but beneath that calm grace, her heart pounded with the rhythm of hoofbeats, something, or someone, from another life, drawing near. Just as the preacher began the vows, the air itself seemed to fold in on a little gathering, a long, taut hush that rapped the bell's last note and held the dust in suspension. Then a small voice cut through like a hatchet. "That's my mama." A boy no older than 6 stood at the edge of the crowd, boots caked with the high prairie's brown, a shirt patched and threadbare, clutching a wooden toy horse with a splintered mane as if it were the only truth he could carry. His words landed with the blunt clarity of a gavel, and the sound spread outward in concentric waves of shock and silence. The preacher's voice fell away mid-prayer. The cottonwoods' leaves stilled. Even the cattle across the low ridge seemed to pause, as if the earth beneath them had tilted. Evelyn's hands froze, white-knuckled around the bouquet, and the flowers slipped from her fingers, petals scattering over the dust like small, pleading flags. For a breath she was perfectly composed, trained calm, the stillness of someone who has learned to hold fear like a coin beneath closed fingers. But beneath that practiced poise something older, more jagged, rose up, breath caught, pulse a small drum against bone. The boy did not speak again at once. He merely held out the toy horse toward her, eyes enormous and steady, and repeated the single, simple claim. Mama, with a voice that trembled at the edges, a child's hymn and accusation folded into one. Thomas Grady felt the room tilt under his boots. The loose sinew at his jaw tightened until it ached. He'd taken Evelyn in because her hands were honest and her labor quieted the long, empty hours on the ranch. He'd taken her in because a man who's lost much will sometimes take a stray kindness as a new beginning. Now that beginning threatened to unravel in one small syllable. Around them the town rearranged itself into murmurs. Old men who had seen more trouble than they'd told their wives exchanged looks that measured betrayal. Women drew their shawls closer, as if to shield themselves from contagion. Children craned their heads, eyes bright with the dread that comes before adults hand them the reasons for sorrow. Some voices rose then sank. Questions, sharp and hungry, questions that tasted like judgment. Rumors, those slow-burning embers the town had fed in quiet corners, flared up. A burned settlement whispered into name, a missing woman, a shadowed lover who died with a gun in his hand. Whispers that suddenly had the boy's small face for a witness. The preacher's hand hovered above the Bible. He knew how to keep order, how to thread prayer through scandal. But even he had no script for a child's claim delivered at an altar. Evelyn's eyes darted once to the ridge and back again, mouth working as if to speak, perhaps to deny, perhaps to plead, but she did not flee. Some muscle in her hunched and readied, a reflex the town could not see but could feel like a tremor. The wooden horse lay between them like a small, accusing relic. It was at once relic and plea, an emblem of innocence and memory. The crowd's silence shifted into a pressure, a living thing that made the preacher sweat and the men shift their weight. Who would step forward to protect the woman they'd begun to call neighbor? Who would step forward to demand the law? Thomas saw, for a heartbeat, not only the woman beside him but the ghost of a life she could have been fleeing. Smoke-lashed nights, a child left in a doorframe, hurried footsteps on the hillside, names burned into the back of the mind. He felt something like grief for a future not yet born. His chest tightened with the knowledge that whatever truth lay behind the child's declaration would not be simple. Evelyn bent, slowly, toward the boy, and when she spoke it was almost a whisper, a name that carried the weight of other places. The syllables trembled in the air and the town leaned in as if to catch confessions like rain. In that suspended moment the prairie itself seemed to hold its breath, between accusation and answer, between the tidy life Thomas had begun and the ragged history Evelyn had worn beneath her skirts, so that every eye there understood they had moved, without consent, into a different story, a story where innocence would press up against old sins, where the moral geometry of the town would be measured in small hands in fractured lullabies, and where the next action, flight, arrest, embrace, or slow explanation, would determine whether mercy or condemnation rode off with the setting sun. The preacher's hand fell from the Bible like a closed trap, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to 3 figures beneath the cottonwood: the preacher, the rancher, and the woman whose past had just been called into the light by a child's simple claim. Thomas Grady looked at Evelyn with an unspooling shock that felt almost like grief, his face hardening where trust and confusion met. She took a backward step as if the ground beneath her had shifted, and the bouquet slipped from her fingers, flowers scattering into the dust like questions that would not be answered. Around them the crowd leaned into the void of silence with the same hunger they brought to any sudden rupture. Neighbors who'd spent long years measuring one another's word with gossip, women who had kept their own smaller secrets folded neat as handkerchiefs, Men who knew when to draw a line and when to let a thing pass. All of them felt the stories seem split open, and murmurs threaded through the air, sharp and speculative, naming places they'd heard once at a saloon table. Ash Creek, the burned back, the outlaw with a reputation for mercy and a fondness for danger. Evelyn's lips moved. The whisper of a name slipped out, thin as thread and heavy as confession. It trembled with accents Thomas did not fully know and carried the memory of another life, one of smoke and hurried goodbyes, of a child's small wrist slipping from a mother's grasp when the night began to burn. The boy, Sam, ran forward then, boots kicking up a thin halo of dirt, and clung to Evelyn's skirt with a blind, urgent faith of children who believe their declarations will reshape the world. His fingers dug into the cloth as if he could anchor her to this moment, to this safety, refusing the idea that she might vanish again like a story half told. Evelyn folded around him, an instinct older than fear, and the sight of that protective, reflective tenderness seemed to sear the onlookers with two conflicting impressions at once: guilt for the accusations they'd already flung into the air, and a sudden, involuntary mercy at seeing a mother and child reunited under conditions none of them had imagined. Thomas watched them, the muscles of his jaw working in a way that said he might strike or he might embrace. Both impulses lived inside him now, twin horses restless behind the same fence. His mind catalogued the facts he knew. Evelyn had come to his ranch months ago. She had cooked and mended and earned her keep with silent diligence. She had no family she'd named. She had been a quiet presence that filled his house the way a new wind might fill an empty loft. The facts the boy's single sentence had introduced were not facts but a history that might undo what kindness had built. The preacher found his voice again, low and measured, trying to stitch ceremony back over scandal. But his words slid off the hot, electric air like rain off oilskin. Law and gospel felt suddenly inadequate to the mess of memory and accusation gathering in that spot. Whispers hardened into questions. Who is she? Did she run with outlaws? Is the child hers? And in their wake, accusations that carried the rough justice of frontier tongues. Submerged, the sheriff be fetched. Some wanted the woman kept safe until truth was clear. Others wanted her gone, an irreparable stain on the town's fragile sense of order. A woman at the back pressed a hand to her mouth. A man beside her spat dust like a verdict. The wooden toy horse lay on the ground between the couple like an altar for a different kind of faith, a relic of a past no one had expected to arrive here today. Evelyn's eyes met Thomas's, and in that contact there was an ocean of unspoken things: fear, shame, the arithmetic of sins she'd tried to balance against survival. And for the first time since he'd offered her the shelter of his name, Thomas tasted the bitterness of uncertainty. He had imagined vows set in sunlight, a quiet life of waking to cattle calls and evenings at the hearth. Instead, he stood before a story that might pull him into lawmen's lists, into debts of loyalty not his own, into choices that would mark him as protector or as judge. The ceremony lay broken. The preacher closed the book without blessing. Petals lay trampled, and the town, which had come to witness a promise, left instead carrying an open wound across its memory, a question that would echo across every porch and back alley until the truth, whatever shape it would take, arrived to be weighed against mercy in the hard gospel of survival on the plains. Dust rose in thin, trailing ghosts as the townsfolk peeled away in murmurs, a slow exodus of questions and small judgments that clung to their hems like burrs. Women pressed their hands to their mouths and leaned into one another as if closer breath might keep scandal from traveling. Men spat into the dust and exchanged looks that weighed heavier than words, and children, who had been delighted by the promise of bells and cake, watched with wide, innocent eyes as adult certainty unraveled into rumor. The wind carried those whispers down Main Street and across the pasture: liar, sinner, runaway, each epithet a pebble skimming the surface of a pond, making concentric ripples that would reach every porch and livery stable before the sunset. Thomas Grady turned his back on the crowd without announcing a verdict. He walked away in the measured, silent way of a man who has learned that sometimes the only honest answer is to leave the moment to itself, to let consequences unspool where they will. His shoulders were broad, his jaw set, but his stride betrayed an inner reckoning, like a plowway thrown down onto a field that cannot be tilled back to untouched. He did not look back to see the way Evelyn bent over the boy, how she gathered him to her with shaking hands that moved like someone trying to stitch a wound closed with thread pulled too thin. Sam clung to her skirt with a fierce, uncomplicated certainty only a child can maintain, the kind of clutch that says I will not be abandoned again. And in the way he pressed his face to her dress, the town glimpsed the raw geometry of loyalty, small and absolute and not yet corroded by the calculus of adult fear. Evelyn's breath came in brittle, measured pulls. She smelled of sweat and lavender, of soot and a life folded into coats and barrels at dead of night. The names she'd thought she'd burned were on her tongue like ash. She cradled the wooden toy horse and ran a thumb over its splintered mane as if it could smooth out the creases in the past. And when she met the faces that lingered, neighbors who had once welcomed her bread and mended her sleeves, she found that mercy was a coin with two sides, one bright and the other dark with suspicion. In the hollow between her ribs, a tide of old fear rose, the fear that had driven her from one ruined town to another, the fear that had made her whisper lies like prayers to keep a child's small body fed and safe. She had thought she'd laid that fear down in some distant night, buried like a coffin beneath miles of plain. But the boy's single, unadorned declaration had dug it up like lightning overturning a grave. Around them, the cottonwood shivered though the air was still, leaves rattling like 1,000 small tongues, and overhead a hawk circled once and then drifted away. Indifferent to human scandal, an old man spat and muttered about law and the need for order. But another, softer-voiced woman shook her head and said the town ought to be careful before it judged. She remembered how quickly the wind could change, how reputation was a brittle thing that splintered with one wrong touch. Someone mentioned the sheriff in a half-sentence and it hung there like a question mark. Whether the law would come as protector or persecutor remained to be seen. Evelyn tightened her arms around Sam and suddenly, in a cough of wind and dust, memory opened. Ash Creek in ghost light, a bank's safe sprung open and flames licking at rooftops. A man bent over a child's cot whispering promises, the stove's last embers smearing the night with copper and smoke. She saw herself then as she had been, hasty, desperate, a woman who had to choose which truths to carry and which to leave like breadcrumbs on a windowsill, and the choice had been cruel. She had left to give the boy a chance at peace. She had thought the road could be an eraser. Now peace stood before her in Sunday best, and the erasure had been inadequate. Her hands, once steady with domestic chores, trembled in a way that belonged to someone suddenly old. She smoothed Sam's hair with motions meant to convince both him and herself that safety could still be made by touch alone. The town's whispers thickened into a murmur of possible futures, a ride to the sheriff's office, a lynching, a quiet leaving in the night, the slow work of clearing a name with papers and witnesses that some suspected did not exist. Each future had its own gravity, and Evelyn felt pulled toward every one of them at once. She swallowed hard against the taste of metal and washed out tea, and in that instant understood the moral contour of the land in a new way, that charity and suspicion live beside each other like neighboring farms, with a barbed wire fence between them, and that crossing from one to the other requires more than a declaration. It requires time, witness, and sometimes blood. As the crowd thinned and the sun dragged its heat toward the west, the cottonwood cast longer shadows across the dirt road, and Evelyn, kneeling in the long gold, promised herself she would tell the truth, whatever form justice took, because in the sound of a child's small voice she had been found, and in being found she could no longer pretend the past did not exist. That night, the prairie lay still beneath the wide, pitiless moon, and inside the small, dim cabin on the edge of town, the light of a dying lantern carved trembling halos on the rough plank walls. The flame's last breath flickered across Evelyn's face, hollowing her eyes into deep wells where the past shimmered like water she could never drink again. Sam lay curled beside her, his toy horse tucked under his arm, and though sleep should have claimed a child after such a day, his eyes stayed wide, glassy with the kind of quiet that only comes from fear too new to name. Evelyn stroked his hair, fingers slow and deliberate, the way one might calm a skittish foal, and when she finally spoke, her voice was little more than smoke, thin, fragile, but carrying with it the weight of all the nights she had held this story inside her chest, afraid that speaking it would make it real again. There was a town called Ash Creek, she began, the name itself tasting like soot, a place where men dug their living from the earth and prayed it wouldn't bury them first. The image rose before her as she spoke, lanterns swinging over mine shafts, the sound of picks clanging against stone, and the weary laughter of men who believed hope was something you had to carve out of rock. She remembered the single street lined with crooked buildings, the saloon with its chipped piano, the church whose steeple leaned like it was tired of pointing to heaven, and the smell of coal dust that never left your skin no matter how many times you washed. She remembered the man too, Jacob Hale, his rough hands, his reckless grin, and the way his voice could melt fear into something bearable. Folks called him an outlaw, and he was, but not in the way the law meant. He robbed no one, killed no one who didn't force his hand, but the world had a way of branding men who refused to bow. He'd come to Ash Creek after riding for months with a price on his head, said he was done running and wanted a quiet life. She'd believed him, against her better judgment, and for a while it had been true. He'd worked at the mine, shared his wages, built them a small home by the river where the willows bent low and made a roof of their own. For a season, she'd known peace. Then the banker came, with ledgers full of lies and promises of expansion. He swindled the miners, pocketed their savings, and when Jacob found out, when he demanded justice for the men who trusted him, the law turned its back. So Jacob gathered the proof, those same ledgers, and made for the sheriff's office under cover of night. But someone tipped the banker off, and before dawn, Ash Creek burned. Evelyn remembered the roar of the flames, the taste of smoke so thick she could barely breathe, and the way Jacob shoved her toward the river with the baby in her arms. "Go," he'd said, eyes wild with love and finality. "I'll find you after." She ran, but the fire ran faster. A beam collapsed between them, and the last thing she saw was his silhouette framed in orange light, holding the ledger like it was scripture, shouting for her to run as the building caved. The explosion swallowed his voice. She'd stumbled into the dark with Sam pressed against her heart, but by dawn, she was alone, the baby gone from her grasp, swept away by the river's current, and the town nothing but ash and ruin. For years she'd searched, following rumors, clinging to every story of a boy found wandering near the trade routes. But hope is a cruel thing. It keeps you breathing long after truth has gone cold. Now, sitting under that same relentless sky, she looked at the boy beside her, the living proof that the river had not taken everything, and though her chest ached with guilt, she felt something like grace slide through the cracks of her heart. "Your daddy was a brave man," she whispered, her voice catching on the word was, "and he died trying to make the world honest." Sam's small hand found hers in the lantern glow, and in that silence, between the breath of memory and the heartbeat of forgiveness, Evelyn understood that the past had not ended in fire. It had only waited for its telling. If you've ridden this far with us, tip your hat and hit subscribe to keep the campfire burning. Every day, we bring another tale from the old frontier, of grit, loss, and the kind of courage the West was built on. Keep your powder dry and your heart wide open to the horizon. Thomas Grady sat alone on the sagging porch of his ranch house, the tin cup in his hand, a cold, heavy thing that kept the world at bay. Now it had folded itself over the pasture, stars pricking the black like pinholes in a blanket, and he let the silence do the talking for him. The silence that tells truth slower than speech, that drips meaning in the small hours. He remembered, with the peculiar clarity of a man who catalogs deeds against debts, the night Evelyn had come to his gate, mud spattered on her skirts, a smear of blood cupped at her wrist, eyes wide and raw as if she'd been carved out of some harder thing and then sanded down by fear. She had come with no papers, no kin, no story that fit the neat boxes men like Thomas keep in their heads. She'd simply said, "Please, let me work," and there had been something in the way she asked, not begging, not demanding, but offering herself as labor, as usefulness, that had drawn him in. He had seen goodness then, or the hollow where he wanted goodness to be. Perhaps the line between them had always been then. He'd taken her in because the ranch needed hands and because he'd known what it felt like to be given a second chance, a small mercy in a world that seared men for lesser sins. Over months she had proven steady. She mended shirts with thread-like patience. She fed the hired hands and set a clean table. She rose before dawn and hummed to the horses when they stamped and whinnied. Her silence had felt like decency, like respect for the work of a man who had spent his life building fences and keeping promises. When she smiled, it was not for show but like a light turned down in an empty room. Thomas let himself believe in the warmth. But the boy's cry at the altar, "That's my mama," had been a flint struck against the brittle surface of his faith. Now, with the cup cooling in his hand, he replayed their months together in slow, careful detail, hunting for the scene where kindness might have met deceit. He remembered small oddities he'd dismissed as old nerves, the way she flinched at the snap of a leather strap, the way, When a rider passed at dusk, she'd unconsciously pressed a palm to her throat as if sealing a name, the hurried entries in the ledger she'd refused to speak about because it wasn't anyone's business. He thought of the look on her face when she'd first learned to ride a horse across his fields. Joy, yes, but shaded by something else, like a woman who learns a new gait to keep from being knocked down again. He felt the weight of his own failure. He had wanted to be the shelter that fixed everything, and maybe he'd been blind by desire. The rancher in him measured obligations. The stead must be kept, the hands fed, the fences mended. The man in him felt betrayed, a rawness under the skin where trust had been. Which had been truer, the woman who had cooked his meals, who had folded his shirts with care, who had spoken quietly at night of books she'd read in places she'd never seen, or the ghost of Ash Creek that the child's voice had conjured? Thomas had always believed that knowing a person was work, like breaking a stubborn mare. You pay attention, you earn the horse's confidence, you never rush. Yet here was a life that might have been running two tracks at once, one of domesticity and one of escape. And he couldn't tell if his tenderness had saved a woman or harbored a fugitive. Anger rose in him, not the loud, showy kind but the slow, corrosive sort that eats at a man's hands when he rests them on his knees. Had she lied to him? Had she used his roof as a mask? Or had she been a woman who'd carried a wound so deep she thought leaving was mercy? He thought of Sam's small face at the altar, eyes like a herd animal's, and the wooden horse between them, an emblem that made simplicity into accusation. The law would come, or neighbors would decide, or things would be settled with words and ledger and possibly blood. Thomas felt the horizon tilt under the weight of consequence. He could turn his back and keep the life he'd begun. He could ride into town and fetch the sheriff. He could stand where he was and wait while the truth crawled out into daylight. Each choice would mark him. In the cool dark, with the prairie breathing around him and the house behind him echoing with quiet, Thomas realized the reckoning was not only Evelyn's to bear, it was his too, because a man who opens his door must be ready for whatever stumbles through it, redemptions and ruins alike. Dawn came like a sober man into Willow Creek, pale and thin, and the sheriff rode up Main Street with his hat low and his horse stamping in the dust as if it, too, suspected the day would be measured in weightier things than bread and work. He dismounted and carried the news like a folded paper that had been handled too often, laying it before the town with a tone that was careful and full of the gravity of facts. He told them Ash Creek had burned the same night the bank was broken into, that ledgers and safes had been rifled, and that witnesses, travelers, drunks at the Two-Bit Tavern, a night herder who'd seen a woman hitch a child to her skirts and ride hard away, had described someone matching Evelyn's looks. He did not declare her guilty. He did not offer vindicating smiles. Instead, he let the air hold the accusation while he watched the town gather it up and weigh it. In his voice there was the memory of law as a tool and as a blunt blade, and he spoke of evidence and rumor with the weary care of a man who knows how quickly a marketplace of opinions can ruin a life. "We've had reports," he said, "and I'll be making inquiries," and the words landed with the authority of a man who could call deputies and summon warrants, but who also had to live here mornings after the dust settled. Thomas Grady stood like a post in the circle of listening faces, silent, hands clenched until the knuckles showed white, the rancher's face a cartography of restraint. He had expected men to talk, to spit verdicts into the open air, but he had not expected the particular ache that accompanied being the man who'd opened his door. Each implication felt like a stone placed on the threshold of his house, one more weight toward an uncertain collapse. The sheriff's caution, his refusal to brand without proof, did little to soothe the friction in the street. Gossip needs breath and feeds on the smallest of facts, and the notion of a woman fleeing with stolen ledgers, riding beside an outlaw until the flames swallowed a town, was a tale the community could not help but fold into its existing anxieties. Evelyn stood with Sam at her side, the child clinging to the hem of her skirt as if he could tether her to the earth. She listened with a face drained of color but composed in that quiet way she had cultivated, stillness as armor. The sheriff's eyes flicked to her, then away. He met her gaze with the same measured courtesy he would show any defendant in court, and she felt it like a mirror that showed a stranger. Evidence and witness statements, the sheriff explained, rarely told the whole of her life. He spoke of ledgers, of names crossed out and sums that hinted at a clever, cruel trick. Yet he also reminded the crowd that smoke and rumor garland themselves around convenient villains until the truth finds its footing. In the crowd, men shifted like restless horses. Some folded their arms into judgment, Others chewed on their thumbs with the worry of men who had old debts and older fears about bank failures and the fragility of contracts. A widow muttered that justice must be done. A young hired hand protested quietly that they should wait for proof before breaking a woman's life. The tonal divide was a seam the town had long learned to sew invisibly. Moral certainty on one side, hesitant mercy on the other. Thomas's silence spoke in a language louder than words. His jaw worked as if testing metal for temper, and each contraction seemed to measure a decision he had not yet made. He could fetch the sheriff himself, call for custody, turn the woman he had sheltered into an item on a docket. He could stand and say nothing, sheltering her while the sheriff followed his inquiries. The choice felt like choosing which fence post to hammer first. One wrong blow and something valuable might splinter. The sheriff, knowing the weight of his role, left the question of immediate arrest on me, but did not soften the implication that the law would need witnesses and ledgers if it were to find a different truth. He promised to look into the Ash Creek connection, to follow leads to the river and the trading routes, to question saloon keepers and the men who'd driven the freight wagons that way. As he rode off, the town's energy rearranged itself into small factions, those who would demand swift action, those who would seek the testimony that could exonerate, and those who simply wanted to avoid being caught on the wrong side of a story. Evelyn's shoulders slumped once the sheriff passed out of sight, and Sam's small hand found hers in the hush that followed. Thomas watched them, and though his fists remained tight, in his chest something shifted, a reckoning not only with Evelyn's possible duplicity, but with his own need to know whether kindness had been misplaced or whether a woman and child had been driven into desperate choices by men with ledgers and cold or hearts. The morning held its breath like a town that is waiting for the scales to settle, and the prairie beyond Willow Creek seemed to listen, the wind moving through the grass as if it were arranging facts into lines where justice might one day read them. The wind pressed against the wooden slats of the old barn like an unkind memory, carrying dust and echoes from the empty fields beyond. The rafters moaned with each gust, and in the half-light that filtered through the gaps, Evelyn sat with Sam nestled close against her chest, the two of them framed by broken beams and the smell of old hay and rusting iron. The night was cold, but it was not the kind of cold that bit the skin. It was the kind that worked its way inside, that settled beneath the ribs, heavy and silent. She held him close, her arms wound around his small frame like they could keep the world from finding them, and hummed a tune older than either of them could name. The lullaby came out cracked and thin, carrying the tremor of guilt more than comfort. But Sam listened, his breathing slowing in fits, his small hand clutching at the fabric of her sleeve as if the rhythm of her voice could make sense of everything he didn't yet understand. The lantern had long gone out, leaving them in the hush between shadows and starlight, and Evelyn felt the weight of the day pressing on her bones, the humiliation of the wedding that had turned to scandal, the whispers that had followed her through the alleys of town, and now the law that might come riding before dawn. She could still see Thomas's face in the dim light of her memory, his eyes clouded not with rage but with something worse, betrayal too deep to name, the kind that made a good man question his own judgment. She had wanted to tell him everything, but truth had a way of tearing open more than it healed. She pressed her lips to Sam's hair, breathing in the faint scent of dust and sun and childhood that clung to him, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine what life could have been, him running through green pastures under a wide, forgiving sky, not knowing what it was to hide or to fear or to carry the burden of his mother's mistakes. But the world had not given them that kind of mercy. "Mama," he whispered, his voice small and full of the kind of ache that only comes when innocence begins to fracture. "Why'd you leave me before?" The question slid between them like a blade she'd been expecting but could never prepare for. She froze, the lullaby dying in her throat. Tears rose, unbidden and hot, and she drew in a breath that shook all the way to her fingertips. "Because I had to keep you safe," she said, her voice breaking on the word safe as though the sound itself resisted being spoken. She turned her face away from him, ashamed of the truth she could not untangle. She remembered the river that night in Ash Creek, the roar of the fire behind her, the water surging cold and black around her knees as she searched for him, screaming his name until her throat tore. She had thought he was gone, carried away by the current or the smoke, and she had wanted to follow, to let the water take her too. But Jacob's voice had been in her ear, fierce and desperate. "Run, Evie, run." And she had run, all the way into exile. Now, years later, the boy she'd lost had found her again, and the miracle of that reunion was bound up in punishment. Sam's eyes were wide and glistening, his brow creased in confusion too old for his years. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, and the question shattered her. "No," she whispered, cupping his face. "You were the only good thing I ever did right." Her tears fell onto his skin, leaving small dark spots like raindrops on dust. Outside, the prairie murmured with the slow voice of night, crickets, the far-off bark of a coyote, the creak of the barn's tired frame, and Evelyn felt the truth of their isolation. Two small souls caught between past and future, hunted not only by the law but by memory itself. She rocked him gently until his breathing evened, the way she used to when he was a baby, her mind wandering between the ghost of the man she'd loved and the life that might never be. She whispered into his hair, "I'll keep you safe this time, no matter what it takes." The promise hung in the air, fragile but real, and though she didn't know how she would keep it, whether through flight, confession, or the mercy of a man whose trust she'd broken, it settled over them like a thin blanket against the cold. The night held its breath, and Evelyn, for the first time since the fire years ago, dared to close her eyes, praying that morning might still bring a chance at redemption. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when Thomas Grady found the trail, small footprints in the dew-damp grass, the faint indentation of a woman's boots beside them, leading west toward the line of cottonwoods that bent over the dry creek bed. The air was still sharp with morning, the kind of chill that carries clarity, and though his rifle hung loose at his side, it was not menace that weighted his hand, it was the need for answers. He followed the prints until they led him to the old barn, half collapsed and silvered with time, its slats whispering in the breeze like the ribs of a dead thing. Inside, Evelyn sat against a bale of hay, her dress torn at the hem, the boy's head cradled in her lap. She looked up at him the way someone looks at a storm, knowing it has already arrived, no longer hoping to outrun it. Her eyes were rimmed red, but steady, as if she had cried herself empty in the night. Thomas stood in the doorway, backlit by the new sun, his shadow long and straight as a judgment cast across the dirt. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the wind filled the silence, carrying with it the distant bleating of a lamp from somewhere on his land. He felt the rough edge of the rifle stock beneath his palm and thought of the choices that rifle had made for him over the years, when to defend, when to end, and how each had carved another notch in the man he'd become. But this choice felt heavier, less simple, because mercy, he realized, demanded a different kind of courage. "Who are you really, Evelyn?" he finally asked, his voice low and tired, stripped of anger. It wasn't an accusation, it was a plea for truth. She swallowed hard, her lips trembling as she brushed a strand of hair from her face, and for a heartbeat he thought she might lie, might hide behind that same guarded grace she'd worn since the day she'd arrived. But then she exhaled, and with that breath, something inside her seemed to break open. "My name isn't Evelyn Hart," she said, her voice no louder than a prayer. "It's Evelyn Hale. Jacob Hale was my husband. The outlaw they said burned Ash Creek." Her words hung between them, heavy and slow, as she told him everything. The banker's theft, the fire that swallowed the town, the letters Jacob had stolen to prove the truth, the night she'd fled with the child and lost him to the river, the years spent wandering from place to place under borrowed names, surviving by work and silence. She spoke of Jacob's death, of his last act of love, of how she'd built her life on the ashes of that night, believing she could start again if she just stayed small enough, quiet enough, good enough. As she spoke, her voice wavered but never faltered, each word a confession carved draw. Thomas listened, his face carved from stone, yet his eyes betrayed him, dark with something more complex than fury. He had imagined betrayal as sharp, like a knife in the ribs, but this felt different, like the slow ache of an old wound reopened, bleeding a truth that demanded empathy. When she fell silent, the world seemed to pause, even the wind stilled, as if unwilling to intrude. The boy stirred in her lap, murmuring softly, unaware of the judgment hovering above him. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hand tightened once on the rifle, then loosened again. He looked at her, at the child, at the ruins of fear and love intertwined before him, and in that silence, he saw what the law could not, a woman who had sinned only by surviving, who had lied only because the truth would have destroyed her sooner. The seconds stretched long as the road beyond the horizon, and then Thomas lowered the rifle, setting its butt gently against the floorboards. "All right," he said finally, his voice rough with something that wasn't forgiveness yet but might one day become it. Then let's start with that. The morning lights spilled through the cracks in the barn walls, thin and golden, and for the first time in days, Evelyn lifted her head without flinching. But the quiet that followed was not peace, it was the deep, dangerous calm before the rest of the world decided what to do with the truth they'd spoken aloud. News on the prairie moves like a summer storm. First a whisper at the ridgeline, then a roar that rearranges everything in its path. And by the time the sheriff and his deputies rode back into Willow Creek, the town had already divided itself into stories and suspicions. The men came with faces weathered to a hard fairness, their boots speaking law, and the warrant they carried seemed to tilt the air. Evelyn Hale was wanted not merely for presence at a burn camp but for fleeing with evidence, ledgers that, if true, proved the banker had been stealing from miners and families alike, the very papers Jacob Hale and his men had risked their lives to secure. The ledger's presence turned rumor into consequence. Neighbors who'd have toted over hard cider now traced their losses in their heads and felt a righteous muscle tighten. When deputies tethered their horses outside the saloon and read the warrant aloud, their words scattered the morning like shot. The town fell into a different sort of hush, the kind that counts dead and reputation on opposite scales and waits to see which will tip. Thomas Grady stood at his doorway holding a folded paper that might have been a petition or a verdict. The edges creased where his fingers squeezed, and he watched Evelyn with a gravity that had nothing theatrical about it. Sam sat close to her, small and bewildered, clinging to a splintered wooden horse as if it were a compass that would point them toward mercy. The deputies moved with the businesslike calm of men accustomed to turning gossip into procedure. They took statements, they asked for witnesses, and they looked into corners where secrets might hide. The toy horse lay on the ground between Evelyn and the law like a mute talisman, and townspeople peered from porches and behind curtains, the human chorus of accusation and pity swelling in uncomfortable harmony. Some called for immediate handcuffs, others argued the town should wait until proof was established, factions forming as surely as storm clouds on the horizon. The complication that haunted every conversation was simple and terrible. Jacob Hale and his men had died trying to lay bare a fraud, and without them alive to testify, the ledger's chain of custody was a story with ragged ends. People could tell, in smoky tavern whispers, of heroic outlaws and righteous vengeance. But justice and ink requires signatures, receipts, and witnesses, not campfire romances. Evelyn, when the deputies asked, did not flinch from the story the child's voice had begun to call aloud. She spoke in a steady, low tone that carried better than the pleas of someone who sought mercy for its own sake. She said she had fled with the ledgers because the banker's theft would have ruined poor men and widows, because Jacob had been trying to force the town to see a truth that paper proved and men with money wanted buried. I ran because I thought I could save what he gave his life for, she told the sheriff, voice threaded with a guilt that tasted like iron, and her words landed among the officials like stones that might shift evidence if the judge allowed them. The sheriff, bound to law, nodded but reminded the crowd that motive did not annul offense. The statutes were clear, the deputies were obliged to enforce them, and the sheriff's face held the tired fairness of a man who knows the prairie will always prefer a quick resolution even if it isn't a just one. Thomas watched all of this play like a scene from a country he'd not chosen to visit. He'd opened his door to a stranger and now faced the gravity of that choice. His silence was a verdict in itself, heavy and slow. He could turn Evelyn over to the law and claim his name on Mart, or he could shelter her and invite the sheriff's sire. Either path would cost him something the town cared for, reputation, or the quiet measure of decency. As deputies prepared to leave for the county seat with orders to bring her in if she could be found, a low wind rose at the edge of town and clouds gathered like witnesses on the rim of the world. People leaned into their decisions as if bracing for rain. The moral geometry of Willow Creek narrowed to two lines, law and mercy, each with its own advocates and its own blind spots. Evelyn tightened her hold on Sam and met Thomas's eyes, and in that look a question passed. Would the man who had given her shelter now measure her by the ledger's ink or by the life she'd tried to protect? Overhead, thunder muttered like a distant headline, and for every mouth that demanded justice there was at least one heart that feared the courthouse would not weigh courage fairly. The storm that gathered was not only in the sky, it had everything to do with whether a small act of survival would be labeled sin or sacrifice. If you've ridden this far with us, tip your hat and hit subscribe to keep the campfire burning. Every day, we bring another tale from the old frontier, of grit, loss, and the kind of courage the West was built on. Keep your powder dry and your heart wide open to the horizon. Dawn came thin and pale over a Willow Creek, the sky a ribbon of bruised lavender and silver, and Evelyn walked to the sheriff's office with the steady, deliberate feet of someone who had decided to trade running for truth. She kept Sam close at her side until the last step, then set him on the porch where he watched with small, bewildered eyes as she crossed the sunlit square, the wooden horse clutched in his hand like a compass that still pointed to hope. The town watched too, faces at windows, men propping themselves on fence posts, women pausing with cups halfway to lips, and the hush that followed her felt like a held breath, an audience waiting to see whether the woman they'd seen cooking and mending and working would stand under the law's gaze and say who she had been. Evelyn's voice, when she spoke to the sheriff, was not the tremulous thing from the barn but a low, clear sound that carried the weight of years. I ain't the woman they think I am, but I'll answer for who I was. There was no flourish in her confession, no plea for mercy that bent toward melodrama. It was an admission that unlocked walls, simple, honest, and heavy with consequence. The sheriff, a man whose life had been measured in ledgers of his own, complaints filed, remedies measured, studied her long, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He had seen women confess to thefts of silver spoons, men confess to crimes of passion, but the kind of truth Evelyn offered was more complicated. It tangled law with sorrow and sacrifice, and the sheriff felt the strain of carrying the tangle toward judgment. Thomas stood in the doorway of his house, hat in hand, the morning light making the lines on his face look deeper as if the years had pressed themselves into his skin. He watched her not with quick judgment but with a kind of raw curiosity that is sometimes closer to fear. Fear that kindness might have been misplaced and that any choice to shelter another could ripple into ruin. The porch wood creaked under Sam's small feet as he shifted, and he clutched his toy horse with the fierce loyalty children use to anchor themselves when adults make storms of their lives. A few townsfolk muttered, some in sympathy, others more inclined to see law as a blunt instrument, but many remained silent, feeling the moral complexity settle over them like morning fog. Evelyn told the sheriff what she'd told Thomas in the barn, but fool her now, the telling shaped by necessity, the banker's theft, the letters that proved it, Jacob's desperate measure to expose the truth, the fire that consumed testimony in men alike, and the ledger she'd taken because it was the only proof the dead had left. She said she'd run with the ledgers because she believed in a truth that could save people, because Jacob and his men had died for it, and because she had hoped, foolishly, maybe, that distance would translate their sacrifice into a life where Sam might be safe. The sheriff's face did not change much as she spoke, but his hands rested on the desk as if bracing for weight. The law required custody and a trail of proof, yet the law also had to account for motive when a jury's heart might be swayed. After she finished, there was a long, grinding silence, the kind that tastes of iron, and the only small movement was Sam nudging his wooden horse into her boot, an innocent ritual that unmade the enormity by making it smaller. The sheriff's questions were procedural, asked not with malice but with the courtesy of a man who knows how fragile formalities can be in the face of human ruin. He asked where Jacob had hidden the ledgers, who else might have seen them, and whether she'd left any note for those who remained. She answered without embellishment, each reply a stone laid on the path to consequence. Thomas listened, the hat in his hands growing warm as blood, and he realized then that whatever the sheriff decided would ripple outward. Neighbors would have to pick sides, Sam would be paraded through hearings by those who thought to prove a point, and the ledger might yet tell a story that saved more people than it ruined. When the sheriff finally spoke, his tone was careful as a man diffusing a trap. He would take her in for questioning, he said, not with a shout or a gavel but with the measured caution of someone trying to hold justice and mercy in the same palm. Evelyn nodded, unflinching, and as deputies moved to take her, Sam reached out and slipped his small hand into Thomas's. The rancher, half forgotten, closed his fingers around the child's like a promise that would be tested. The porch seemed to tilt in the sudden motion of men, law, and fate aligning. The town exhaled in a dozen small sounds, grief, relief, curiosity, and the prairie beyond the main street stretched indifferent and vast, as if the earth itself waited to see which story would stay, the one born of ledgered truth, or the ragged tale of love that burns for reasons older than law. Days after the sheriff's office had closed its doors on Evelyn's confession, Thomas Grady found a letter folded in his mailbox like a small animal left for mercy, the paper thin and smelling faintly of the lantern smoke that seemed forever to cling to awards. His fingers trembled as he opened it, not from fear of what it might say, but from the strange tenderness that had lodged in him since that first night she'd come asking only for work. The handwriting was small, each letter leaning into the next as if the pen had been pressed by a hand that had held too many burdens for too long. And when he read the lines, "You showed me kindness when I thought I'd lost all right to it. Tell Sam his mama didn't run this time." The words sat in his chest like a hot coal that refused to cool. He read it twice, then a third time, because paper can mean many things and a few sentences can be a map to the human heart. The letter carried more than plea. It carried thanks, the kind that was raw as a fresh bruise and as honest as any ledger in the sheriff's office. The surrounding air was a crisp thing that made each breath sting, and Thomas felt it all pull taut. The ranch, the sheriff's badge, the murmur of the town that had been rearranged by confessions and rumors. He folded the letter with care he had reserved for other men's wills, sliding it into his vest pocket so it might rest near his heart where kindled things go to keep warm. People at the feed store noticed the way he moved slower that morning, the way his fingers lingered on the counter as if measuring a distance he had to cross, and folks who had expected him to ride out with gun and judgment found themselves watching instead for a gentler motion, the slow method of a man who had decided that some actions had to be done alone. The ranch felt quieter when he mounted. Horses seemed to know when the weight on a man's back carried a decision heavier than the usual errands, and Thomas sat his draw, feeling the letter's text like a companion in his pocket, a witness to a promise he hadn't yet spoken aloud. He thought of Evelyn in the dim cell where the sheriff kept paperwork and prisoners alike, and of Sam on that porch with his toy horse clutched like a pledge, and the image made the inside of his chest ache the way old scars do when the weather turns. As he rode toward town, memories jarred like loose nails, the way Evelyn had scrubbed a stubborn stain from a shirt without complaint, the hush of her voice in the kitchen as she set bread to cool, the look she gave the boy that belonged to a woman who had not lost her capacity to love despite the world's attempts to teach her otherwise. The road smelled of dust and the low grass that still carried dew from a night of threatened rain. Every hitch in his mount's step echoed a question: what does a man keep when the town demands a different ledger? He arrived in town with the sun low and slanting, the sheriff at his office door with the sort of guarded face men wear when they have more facts than comfort, and his hat in hand, the letter folded and visible now like an offering. He did not move with the quickness of a man about to make an accusation. He moved like someone who had accepted that some reckonings require patience, and that mercy is its own form of work. The sheriff looked up, measured the angle of Thomas's shoulders, and nodded once without warmth but not without respect, a recognition that men sometimes must choose between the law's clean edges and a life's messy truths. Thomas handed the folded paper over as if it were evidence and not entreaty, and in doing so he offered the sheriff another perspective, not only the ledger that might sway a court, but the small human epilogues that rarely fit inside a warrant. He asked then, quietly, if Sam might be spared the spectacle of a town's judgment for a while, if the child could be kept from courtroom corners where pity and accusation sit in uncomfortable partnership. The sheriff studied the letter, thumbed the ink with the cautious curiosity of a man who reads more than lines when he reads a person, and then, in a voice that had the roughness of a well-used rope, agreed to look into softening the boy's exposure while inquiries continued. Thomas folded his hat into his hands and felt the weight of decision settle into him like a new bone. He rode back to the ranch with the slow purpose of a man who would promise to carry whatever consequence arrived, because the letter had changed something fundamental in him. He could not unsee the woman who had been found, and he could not unhear the plea, tell Sam his mama didn't run this time. The prairie seemed to exhale as he crossed it, as if the land itself approved small acts of kindness, and Thomas, with the letter pressed against his heart, rode into the evening light toward a tomorrow that might yet be gentler than the day that had broken them. The afternoon sun slanted low through the narrow window of the sheriff's holding cell, laying bars of gold light across Evelyn's face and the cracked stone floor beneath her feet. She sat there, hands folded loosely in her lap, wrists raw where the cuffs had rubbed, her breath shallow but steady like someone who had already made peace with consequence. The cell smelled faintly of iron and dust, and beyond the window came the slow hum of the town at work, hammer strikes from the blacksmith, a cart creaking by, a dog barking somewhere far enough that it might as well have been another world. She stared at the patch of light near her boots, where the dust glimmered in the sun like tiny particles of grace, and thought of how strange it was that after all the running, all the nights hiding in half-prayers whispered into wind, peace could come dressed as confinement. The door opened softly, hinges sighing, and Thomas Grady stepped in with the slow deliberation of a man who had wrestled his heart into silence. He removed his hat, setting it gently on the wooden bench by the wall, and for a long moment he didn't speak. His eyes searched her face as though trying to memorize every line before the law and its machinery took her away for good. "The boy's safe," he said at last, his voice low but carrying. "He knows the truth." The simplicity of those words landed heavier than any sermon. Evelyn looked up, the faintest tremor catching in her breath, and when she blinked, tears slipped down her cheeks, not the hysterical kind that demand comfort but the quiet, final kind that come when there's nothing left to fix. "Then I can rest," she whispered, and the words broke something soft inside both of them. For a while neither moved. The silence between them became its own living thing, dense with everything they hadn't said, the trust built and broken, the affection neither dared name, the mutual understanding that life sometimes writes love in the margins of tragedy. Thomas stepped closer, the wooden floor groaning under his weight, and leaned a shoulder against the bars. He studied her like a man memorizing scripture, trying to take some fragment of her peace back with him. "The governor will read the report," he said, not as comfort but as fact. The sheriff sent the ledgers in his statement. "Folks are starting to see what really happened at Ash Creek. Might be there's light at the end of this." Evelyn smiled faintly, the expression worn and luminous all at once. "Light's never been afraid of waiting," she murmured. Outside, a wind kicked up across the street, howling down the alleyways, carrying the faint metallic scent of coming rain. The smell seeped in through the cracks in the window frame, damp and clean, and for a moment the cell felt almost like a sanctuary, small, still, honest. Thomas reached for the bars, his calloused fingers brushing the metal just above her hands, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him radiating through. "You didn't have to come," she said quietly. "You didn't owe me that." He shook his head once, slow and deliberate. "No one knows kindness," he said. "That's what makes it mean something." Her throat caught on a sob she didn't let free. She wanted to tell him he had saved her, not from the law, not from the town's judgment, but from the endless ache of believing no one could see her without suspicion. But she didn't. Instead, she lowered her gaze, watching the shifting light crawl higher on the wall as the afternoon stretched. "Take care of him," she said finally, and he understood without asking who she meant. "I will," he said, his voice rough as gravel. They stood like that for another long minute, two figures divided by iron and light, until the sheriff's boots clicked in the hallway, announcing the end of the visit. Thomas picked up his hat, pressing the brim against his chest in the old gesture of respect reserved for funerals and vows alike. As he turned to leave, a single tear slid down Evelyn's face, falling soundless to the dusty floor, and for a strange, fleeting second, it seemed to shimmer there like gold. The wind outside rose again, rattling the door, and the first low rumble of thunder rolled over the plains, deep and promising, as if the sky itself was preparing to wash everything clean. The morning began with a sky the color of tarnished silver, clouds hanging low over Willow Creek as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. And when the rider appeared on the horizon, just a small figure against the trembling line of light, every heart in town seemed to pause between one beat and the next. The messenger came with the calm authority of purpose, dust ghosting his boots, a leather satchel bouncing at his side, and when he dismounted before the sheriff's office and handed over the folded parchment sealed with the governor's mark, it was as though a wind passed through the crowd, soft and electric, carrying with it the weight of unspoken prayers. The sheriff read in silence, his lips moving as his eyes tracked the lines of ink that would change a woman's life, and when he finally looked up, his face, stern, worn, made for judgment, broke into something like reluctant grace. "She's free," he said, voice steady but rough, and the words spread outward, catching on every breath, every whisper, until even the blacksmith down the road heard and stopped his hammer mid-swing. The doors to the small holding cell opened a few heartbeats later, creaking slow as if the building itself wanted to savor the sound, and Evelyn stepped into the light. The air outside smelled of coming rain, the kind that tastes like renewal before the first drop even falls, and when it did, The sky let loose not in fury but in forgiveness, soft sheets of water slipping down the eaves, sliding through the cracks of old wood, finding the earth with a gentleness that spoke of something sacred. Evelyn's first breath of free air trembled, catching between disbelief and relief. She looked thinner, her hair unbound and darker from weeks in shadow, yet in her eyes burned the quiet strength of someone who had walked through fire and found her way out on her own 2 feet. Sam saw her before anyone else, his smaller form bursting through the rain like a bird loosed from a cage, feet pounding across the muddy ground, his voice high and breaking, "Mama." And when she dropped to her knees to catch him, the town watched in reverent silence as mother and child folded into each other, both laughing and crying, faces pressed close as though trying to reclaim every day that had been stolen. The rain clung to them, threading through their hair, dripping from their lashes, and in that water the dust of old judgment began to dissolve. The whispers, the doubt, the years of exile that had clung to Evelyn like smoke. Thomas stood a few paces back beneath the cottonwood, hat held low over his brow, and though he said nothing, his expression spoke what words could not: pride, sorrow, gratitude, and the dawning realization that sometimes the right thing and the lawful thing lived miles apart, and a man's worth was found in knowing which path to choose when those miles met. The townsfolk lingered at the edges of the square, their faces softened by the rain, and in the hush that followed the downpour's steady rhythm, something within them began to shift, perhaps not full forgiveness, but understanding, which was rarer and more enduring. The sheriff, for his part, gave a nod that felt like benediction before retreating inside to pour himself a coffee stronger than regret, leaving the town to its small miracle. Evelyn lifted her face to the sky, eyes closed, letting the rain strike her skin like baptism, and when she opened them again, her gaze found Thomas across the way. She mouthed a single word, "Thank you," and he tipped his hat once, as if sealing a promise neither would need to say aloud. Around them, the prairie darkened and gleamed, rain tracing silver rivers through the earth, filling the ruts left by wagon wheels, smoothing over the scars of a place that had seen too much division. The storm would pass, as all storms do, but its memory would linger in the clean scent of wet sage and the hush that settles after truth has been spoken. Evelyn took Sam's hand and began walking, not back toward the past but forward into the open country, her steps slow and sure, each one leaving behind her print that the rain soon erased. For the first time in years, she didn't look over her shoulder. The clouds above broke just enough for sunlight to pierce through, a golden wound in the sky, and as it spread across the plains, the bells in the chapel, untouched since that ruined wedding day, began to ring again, not in mockery but in grace, their echoes carrying through the rain as if the land itself had chosen to remember her not as the woman who ran, but as the one who stayed under the vast, weeping sky. Thomas took Evelyn's hand once more, and this time the gesture carried no theater, no preacher's voice, no village breath held in judgment, but the honest weight of two lives that had been tested by fire, river, and law. The prairie stretched around them like an old, patient witness, grass bowed and glittering with rain, and the cottonwood above whispered its slow approval as if to say even the earth forgives what it cannot prevent. Thomas's fingers closed around Evelyn's, rough and warm, and in that simple clasp there was the reimbursement of a debt neither had counted in coin, the cost of shelter given and the cost of truth returned. Sam stood between them, small and fierce, cradling his splintered wooden horse like a relic, his cheeks still wet with the rain that had baptized them into this new chapter. He looked up at the two of them with the solemn clarity of children who understand more about loyalty than most grown men, and in his eyes Thomas saw the futures the man had not been sure he could hold. There were no vows, no rehearsed promises to claim to a crowd, but there were words, fewer and truer. "Let's start again," Thomas said, his voice low as a barn door closing on a long night, and the sentence held the gentleness of a man who had learned that starting over is not a flourish but a work of steady hands and steady days. Evelyn smiled through tears that caught the late light like small lanterns, and the curve of her mouth was more confession than coquettishness, and it was the admission that she had been forgiven enough to try, and that forgiveness was both mercy and task. Around them the town moved as if waking from a dream. Some faces softened, some remained guarded, but none could deny the moment had changed the moral geometry of Willow Creek, where once the chapel bells had marked accusation. Now they rang like a metronome, keeping time for the slow repair of what had been broken. The sound floated over the fields, soft, not triumphal, and it felt to Thomas like an ordinance of a land that had seen harder things than rumor could, in its quiet way, judge with the patience of seasons. He looked down at Evelyn's hand in his, tracing with his thumb the calluses earned by her nights of work and by the years when she had kept fear small for the sake of a child. Each mark told a story he had not known at first, a ledger of suffering rewritten into care. And he understood then that the measure of a life is not only the clean record a man can show in daylight, but the scars he carries into it. Evelyn breathed in then out, and the breath made a small sound like a beginning. She squeezed Sam's shoulder and said, almost to herself, "We'll plant corn where there's been only stone." A plain, domestic promise that contained a world of repair, because in frontier places redemption is not a sermon but a season, work, patience, and the courage to be seen. Thomas nodded, had in his other hand a gesture that was both vow and acknowledgement, and he felt the strange, steady lift of hope that comes not all at once but in increments. Feeding a child, mending a fence, sitting at a table so small graces can be counted. The prairie inhaled and exhaled around them. A hawk drifted high, indifferent and dignified, and somewhere a bell tolled again, soft, like a distant memory, and the sound stitched itself into the day. They stood like that for a long while. 3 figures at the seam of wind and earth, no witnesses required, no audience left to judge, while the town behind them resumed the noisier work of being human, tending livestock, mending roofs, trading gossip that would someday grow gentler. Thomas realized, looking at Evelyn, that a promise needn't be dramatic to be real, it needed only to be kept. He spoke then, quieter than before, "I'll watch over him," and the words were iron and bread together, strength and sustenance. Evelyn's answer was a small, wet laugh and a nod that sealed more than a contract. It sealed a pact born from the hard stuff of frontier life, truth acknowledged, debt repaid, a shared labor towards something that might, by slow degrees, be called home. The clouds broke a little above the ridge and sunlight knifed through in an arrow band, painting their hands in gold. The prairie seemed to hold its breath and then let it go, and in that release the bells, once symbols of ruin, rang softly in the distance, not as a verdict but as benediction. The 3 of them turned then, together, toward the long road home, each step settling dust into the earth like a promise kept, and the wind, which had carried whispers and rumors and finally the truth, moved on, leaving behind the smell of wet sage and the quiet knowledge that some stories end not in spectacles, but in the small, sustaining work of starting again. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.